Welcome back to Rethinking Politics, episode 74. We're gonna just do this thing.
Sorry, we're laughing because Dan was trying to psych himself up to start, and he was bobbing his head like a weirdo, and I just...
It was mainly for Brad's amusement. I don't actually try and psych myself up with anything, but like, I sometimes look at something funny. I don't know.
Well, it worked for me because that's what I did. Looking at you.
Then my performance was good. That's
Congratulations, sir.
Today we're going to start with the polls. There is a Gallup poll that is out that is absolutely abysmal. If you've been following news, you've probably heard about it at this point. The poll indicates that at the beginning of 2021, there was a 49%. So the way they look at the parties is you have the actual people who are Republicans and Democrats and registered. Then you have people who lean that way, who are independent but lean that direction and may or may not be registered. Mm-hmm. Right? Registration.
Yeah, so it's just general party affiliation, Republican or Democrat.
Yes. So this includes people who lean and people who say they are straight up.
Mm-hmm.
So at the beginning of 2021, you had 49% Democrats, 40% Republicans.
Yeah, which is a huge lead. The Democrats hadn't had a lead that big since 2012.
Yeah, and why would there be a lead that big? I don't know. January 6th, Donald Trump, the change of election, people not happy with COVID, right? It's pretty obvious why there's this is a reaction to the things in the moment that may have turned into something long-term and substantial, may not have. By the second quarter of the year, the Republicans go up to 43%. Right, we get a little bit of shift. By the third quarter, Democrats drop from 49 to 45%, Republicans up to 44%. And then by the fourth quarter of 2021, Republicans up to 47%, Democrats down to 42%.
And I know these numbers can be hard to visualize, but the significant fact here is that in the space of a year, party dominance has basically flipped. Oh, look at that, you're screen sharing. And everyone can see how many tabs you have open. Clearly you're in love with the CDC.
I'm in complete control here. I want you to know these tabs are just for my podcast section. So there you go. You can see the numbers up if you're looking at it on YouTube. You were going to give us a better description, Brad, though, for those of us who are joining only by audio.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the significance here is that the numbers are all in the 40s, which make them sound insignificant. But the significant fact here is that at the beginning of this year, Democrats had a 9-point lead over Republicans, which is a huge gap. Mm-hmm. Normally, they're much closer. And then by the end of this year, you have a huge shift where now all of a sudden the Republicans have a 5-point lead over the Democrats. It would be significant if we ended this quarter at the 45-44 numbers where they were about the same. That would be a huge comeback for the Republicans. But for it to swing all the way over like this is absolutely nuts and very impressive for the Republicans.
It is. To put it in perspective, so the Republicans, generally speaking, the Republicans are down by this metric. Now, how far down they are isn't particularly important. If you've got a kind of, because how well this translates into the vote, the ratio of the numbers here and how it translates into the vote varies. So when they're even, it looks like the Democrats have a slight lead, generally speaking, when the parties are about equal. At this point, with this shift to, let's see, so from 9 points ahead to 5 points behind, a 14-point shift is how you might frame this. It's extremely high. I heard the Republicans haven't had this level of a lead
since
measuring
1995.
It this way. Yeah, yes, which coincided. Which coincided with the victory of the Persian Gulf War, right? Which is the victory of a war is a big deal. And wars tend to bring support, or at least they used to. At this point, that's probably not a good general rule anymore. Anyway, for a closer breakdown, you can see these numbers here. The Democrats, you can see this breaks down further by who is actually solidly Democrat and solidly Republican versus who is leaning that way. And one of the most interesting things about this is if you were a Democrat and you don't like Biden, you're looking at this and you're like, Biden, not a good president, incompetent on a variety of levels, etc. The odds that you become Republican are small. That usually isn't what happens. Usually what happens is you become more independent, or you simply stay Democrat and you're just unhappy with the president. So for there to be an actual shift of this size,
yeah, because
is crazy.
This is different than just presidential approval.
Yeah,
because you can respond to a poll and say, yeah, I think the president's garbage right now, but you're still going to vote all Democrat in the midterms, and you'll still vote for a Democratic president next election. But when you get a phone call and say, yeah, I'm no longer Democratic leaning, I am now Republican leaning, that's crazy. That's a significant shift.
That is a significant shift. And the numbers, so Republicans picked up 3% on people who say they are Republican and 4% on people who are Republican leaning. It's a pretty big shift. Pretty big shift. Democrat leaning dropped 5%, and solidly Democrat dropped 2%. It's interesting. I was looking at, the numbers aren't on this particular page. There's a historical trends of it. But the, it's my understanding that a significant amount of the shift is in young people. And if you're familiar with the way the age demographics are, generally the young support the Democrats, the older support the Republicans. And so for the shift to come from the young is a bad sign. And it also happens to be in some cases along the racial lines as well. The coalition of race seems to be shaking. It's never particularly secure, but there was this idea There was this idea when Obama was president that the coalition of race was going to be a permanent thing. And that with that coalition, in addition to the voters that they already had, the Democratic Party was going to be unbeatable. Obviously, that has turned out to be false. But even the current coalitions seem to be shaking up quite a bit. This is all good news. Not necessarily because I like the Republicans. The Republicans are, well, they have their problems. As you may have noticed, Brad and I often critique them as much as we're critiquing the Democrats. Obviously, right now with the Democrats in power, there's more to critique there. And that's always the case.
Once the Republicans start doing things again, we're going to be happy to critique them.
That's right. That's right. For now, it's hard to do with, what would we be critiquing? The style of their complaints?
Maybe we should do that.
Maybe. Of all of the legislators, who is the most stylish and well-spoken?
Who's
the least annoying?
Well, the least annoying is Joe Hum you've never heard of.
That's true. It's true. It's the guy who you've never got any attention. Yeah. So why have the polls shifted is pretty obvious. We've talked about Biden's presidency at length, gone through some of the major failures. It's still a shock to me that he's failed on such an epic scale. But one of the most interesting things about why that would lead to a shift towards republicanism rather than just a shift of Biden's terrible, right? His approval ratings tanked, which we expect. But the approval rating is one thing. Going Republican is something entirely
another.
different. Yeah. And here's my working theory.
Let's hear it.
The reason that people have shifted to Republican, and is in part, of course, because they're out of office and they don't have anything to do or prove. they can just point out problems to the other side. This always happens when you're out of office. But beyond that, government has never looked so incompetent in the U.S. Perhaps never. There's probably times, in individual moments. But across the board, in every sphere, government is looking incompetent. From your daily interactions with the police to how COVID is being handled, the fact that you can't get tests right now, hospital shortages being provoked in part by vaccine mandates and other things, the Afghanistan withdrawal, right? Maybe if nothing else, our military is still the greatest in the world. Well, that may or may not be true, but it certainly looked really bad in our last looks with the military. The intelligence agencies. I hear people joking about intelligence agencies now. We see some criminal act, and the first thought from people like Joe Rogan is, how many of them are feds? how many of the people are feds? And it's become a good question, unfortunately. That's a bad sign. I was thinking specifically about the intelligence agencies, Brett. How do you go from where we are now to having people hear from the CIA that there's an international threat and they believe them?
And taking it seriously at all, yeah.
And you're not like, prove it. You're like, okay, the CIA says there's some kind of trust given to the intelligence agencies. We're a long...
No, I mean, we think of the CIA right now like Soviet Russians thought of the KGB.
Yeah. Yeah, that it's actively a threat to you.
Yeah, that it's not an organization that protects you, but it's an organization that often works against you.
Yeah, that's a good comparison, unfortunately. Yeah, that's the state of it, right? Which part of the government is operating competently? None of the ones that are getting attention. And the CDC is perhaps the most in the news right now, because it is walking back all kinds of things, and it's accepting things that its naysayers have been saying for over a year, and some of them much longer.
Yeah, and then the actual federal government that we think of beyond the agencies, Congress and the president, you've got a Democrat president, and weak Democrat control of Congress that has resulted in very, very little.
Very little. I'm trying to think. They've passed a few helping bills that were somewhat bipartisan. Initially, was there one, two? At least one.
And then they got the infrastructure bill.
And then the infrastructure bill. Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, to be fair, is not as controversial as the Republicans made it out to be.
No, it's not. And the Republicans,
not that I'm in favor of it, but it's not. It's not as controversial as they made it out to be.
Yes. Really, as far as the general divide between Republicans and Democrats,
it's the kind of bill that you could see a Republican president pushing for.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And that wouldn't be insane.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. So here's the good news. If you're listening to this,
I'm listening. What's the good news, Dan? I didn't know we had good news to offer here.
The vast majority of business and interactions in the United States are governed by federal agencies. And the ones that aren't are governed by state agencies. And there's no escape from these people. That's the
Might I interest you in a dictionary? Sir? Are you okay?
I'm doing just fine today. I'm personally recovering from COVID. It was spectacular. And while my mental faculties are still subpar, my sense of humor is
your sarcasm is through the roof.
Yeah. I've been dosing up on 20 milliliters of sarcasm every 4 hours for the past week.
I heard a Joe Rogan episode about how effective sarcasm is at defeating COVID, so that makes sense. The CDC won't tell you that, though. They've covered it up.
They won't. Yeah, which is why my voice is weird. You can probably hear it to some degree. congested. Yeah, so here we are, right? This is the United States. It's run by organizations exactly like the ones that in the moment of trial have revealed themselves to be utterly incompetent. And it's run by these agencies at every level in ways that you can't imagine. Things that are so far below the surface of what's discussed that it's entirely invisible. At the level of how the stock exchange interactions work to a large degree, right? And how things are priced even in what appears to be market interactions is determined in large part by a gathering of bankers that is nearly invisible, that are all part of the FCC and the massive bureaucracy there, and other things like that, right? This is
No, I mean like the Federal Reserve and interest rates that directly affect inflation. You know what I mean?
Yes, in some ways the Federal Reserve has become the most visible of these, even though we don't visible in the sense that it gets public attention. I mean, we don't actually know what they're doing because it's all secret. If you knew, then it would ruin the effect, apparently.
Yeah,
if you knew who was getting the bailouts and who was getting free money, that would ruin the whole illusion that this was a wonderful thing happening. Anyway, sorry, sarcasm aside, you were going to say.
No, my point was just that monetary policy in the United States is almost entirely decided, by administration, not by legislation, not even by executive authority. You know what I mean? It's by this something else.
Yes, which drives home again a point we've made several times, that the legislature is the governing body in the United States. It's the active body. Was. On paper.
It's supposed to be.
On paper, the legislature is supposed to be doing things, and other bodies react to what it does and enforce what it does.
Mm-hmm.
At this point in time, that's not what happens at all. That's not what happens at all. In fact, the legislature does virtually nothing, and yet massive amounts of regulations and laws continue to move through. Now, that massive problem, we've put it in the context before of the four branches of government and how they work, and concluded that the most likely way forward, or the only group that is acting with any degree of efficacy in this sphere, is the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has decided two important cases recently. And somewhere between the two is the closest we're going to get to a signal of what to expect in the future on this issue. Right now, there's a fundamental constitutional question about whether the legislature can give authority to administrative agencies. And if it can, how much and how open-ended can it be? How specific does it have to be for the legislature to, for the statutes that govern a group like OSHA, which is one of the cases we're going to talk about, how specific does the legislature have to be with what they can do and what they authorize before they've crossed a line and they've made OSHA a legislative body? Mm-hmm. So the basic idea is the legislature can do legislative things, but it cannot make someone else the legislature, right? Your elected official cannot say, having been duly elected, I now pass my authority to Brad. Brad is now your legislator for all intents and purposes. That would be illegal.
Mm-hmm.
The legislature is the body in which these powers are invested. To get into the legislature, you have to go through certain things. The very concept that we are some kind of democracy depends on the fact that the legislature has the power, exercises the power, and nobody else exercises that same legislative power.
Yeah, I mean these agencies that we do have, when they were created, it was explicit in their creation that they are instruments of implementation. That you've got a congressional body made up of these representatives who can't ensure that the laws are carried out the way they want them to be by themselves. And so just like you have congressional aides who help them get legislation through, you're creating, not legal aids, because that sounds like they're going to work for lawyers, but
essentially,
aids
yeah.
in the form of organizations that are going to implement the intent and the explicit wording of whatever the law is. And that was the purpose of the agencies. Congress says we want to ensure that food is treated a certain way in the United States before it gets to the consumer. So we can't just pass a law that says food needs to be good. We need more than that. It needs to be more nuanced and respond to certain things in certain ways. And so we're going to create an agency that has certain limits on it and restrictions on it about what it can do, because its only purpose and its only legitimacy comes in fulfilling our law. And then you get the USDA, and they go and they regulate on behalf of Congress, which you'll see immediately starts to come up against that line. Even when it's first created, these agencies push up against that line. It's something we've talked about before, about how these agencies really are this legislative executive hybrid that reaching where we are today, where they are out of control, seems almost inevitable. Yeah. That you hand them this small amount of power, and it's inevitable that they're going to try and grow it as they attempt to execute not just the explicit law, but also the intent behind the law. And the easiest way to execute the intent behind the law is to start adding to the law themselves, which is when they become, as you said, a legislature of themselves, which is something that the Supreme Court can and has checked in the past.
Yes, thank you. There's an early case on this. I don't have the Supreme Court cases up in front of me, the extended ones in this sphere. We've discussed them before, though, and I probably mentioned this one by name at some point. But they created I don't remember if it was a commission or an agency, but the stated mission was to set prices and tariffs and things so that in international commerce, the American industries were able to compete with the foreign industries, right? And so they had a specific goal, they had a specific means in which they were authorized, and a range through which they could then set the price, right? So this thing, the reason that you would want an agency to do this instead of the legislature is the agency can act regularly on it and pay attention to it, and the legislature can then spend its time elsewhere, right? Having established the mission, the goal, and some parameters around it, they then allow this agency to act within that range. That's one possibility of how these agencies can look. Others can be like OSHA, where their stated goal is to protect workers, and they're able to do essentially, depending on who you ask, they're either granted a specific range of things that they can do that, or they're given all power to achieve that end. And that's kind of how the lines on which this case is decided. Go ahead.
Well, and I'd say for the record that in terms of explicit authorization, they aren't granted all power, because when you look at this OSHA case, which is the National Federation of Independent Businesses versus the Department of Labor, Occupational Safety, and Health Administration, which I'm still not sure how it spells out, OCEA, but it's fine.
Shots fired. We can't mention OSHA without pointing out that Brad initially spelled it wrong.
Oh yeah, is that how it happened?
That is how it happened. He's still convinced that it's OCEA. That's anyways, all right. I'm here for you, Brad.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that support. For all of you new listeners out there, Dan's full of crap.
It's important to know.
I was about to say you've derailed me, but actually it was me, so that's unfortunate. Oh, what I was going to say is that it's clear from both the dissent and the majority opinion that they understand that there are clear limitations on OSHA. They just disagree on what those limitations mean. Because OSHA, when they enacted this mandate, they were very clear, well, at least clear as they could be, about where they were getting their power from. They said, okay, here we have this power to do an emergency ruling that only lasts 6 months when certain criteria are met. It has to be like in this, I can't remember the exact wording, but this imminent threat to workers and a couple other things that it had to qualify in order to work. And so here, I think everyone's in agreement that these agencies can't do anything they want.
Yes.
But what really gets into the discussion here is how you interpret the law. And this is something we'll find time and time again with the Supreme Court, is they have so much leeway in how they look at the law. Because you would think, if we're just reading the law, that 9 people who are well educated on how the law works should agree,
their entire lives.
Should agree, yes, they either have this authority or they don't. And the reason they don't agree is because of how you choose to interpret things. And how you choose to interpret things is based off of what you want. And with this opinion, you can see that clearly, that the dissent, so those who believe that the vaccine mandate should have stayed, one of their primary reasons, and they make it very clear in their first paragraph, is that they are concerned about COVID, that COVID is dangerous, and therefore OSHA should have more power. That yes, in the minutia of the law, it could go either way, depending on how you looked at it, which means it should go the way we need, because that's the good thing to have happen. Versus the other side, which says it doesn't matter what's good, it matters what the law is, what the law actually provides for OSHA to do.
Yeah, in the way that the conservatives who struck down the OSHA mandate would reply to that is to say that if there is something that how specifically it needs to be mentioned, how clearly it needs to be spelled out what they can do, depends in part on the size of what they're trying to do. So they cite another case, and this is a precedent in the court that if there is a broad portion of a regulatory scheme, it's something sizable, fundamental to the project, large scale, affects a lot of people, these kind of things must be clearly mentioned, because vague wordings that may or may not authorize them shouldn't be sufficient to authorize. If you're intending to allow them to do major things, it seems probable that you would explain that, right? If you're
basically what it comes down to is there are large statements and paragraphs and words upon words in these authorizations that Congress has enacted for these agencies, and very often they say things like this and other things as needed.
Yes,
and if you interpreted it loosely, it would mean that these agencies could do anything that they wanted to
fulfill
do.
Their mission.
And so what they're saying is, no, there has to be more than that. We can't interpret it that way. We have to say, okay, what was the clear directive that was explicitly stated by Congress for this agency to do? And if they aren't doing that, then they don't have authorization for it, no matter what the minutia of the wording might indicate. Is that what you're saying, Dan?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And they talk about that at length in both of these cases, because that's key to interpreting whether or not the regulatory agency is acting constitutionally. If like you said, if you allow the vague statement like that to say, so OSHA can do something that it has never done and require people to be vaccinated. Not just the working
something
conditions,
that it has never
something
done,
external.
And there seems no clear indication that when it was created that it was intended for anything close to that.
Yes. So in some ways you have here the classic constitutional debate between a loose reading and a tight reading of the Constitution.
Except this is not the Constitution.
Right. That's true. Of constitutional law in general. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Do you want to say, is the goal flexibility so that you can address emergencies? Or is the goal a strict reading so you can limit abuse? Right? And there is a trade-off here. That I think I'm strongly on the side of a restricted reading, in part because of the incompetence of the agencies that I mentioned above. If it is so reasonable and so good for health, then make the persuasive case. But
primarily, though, because it undercuts the entire system. Because
yes.
As I said earlier, the purpose here is you've got Congress who creates the law, and then you've got agencies that are put in place to help Congress and the executive branch enact and execute these laws.
Yes.
In other words, they're agencies that work for, these heads of government, whether it's Congress or the president, which means that they should be subservient to Congress. And what's interesting here is in this case, you have OSHA creating a mandate that was clearly designed as a workaround because they did not have congressional approval for any kind of national mandate.
Yes.
In other words, the organization who created OSHA doesn't want OSHA to do this, and yet OSHA feels like it's their prerogative as an independent actor to enact it anyways.
Yeah.
Even when I think the Senate passed a resolution, I can't remember the exact wording, but in direct opposition to this mandate. In other words, it completely flies in the face of the argument that OSHA is simply working for the federal government, because now it's clearly saying, no, OSHA is its own thing that can think for itself and not just execute the will, not just execute the explicit intent of the legislation, which would mean following the strict law, and not just enact the will of Congress, because clearly it's against their will, but rather to just do their own thing based off of what they think is correct. And by they, I mean the agency itself.
Yes.
And that's a terrible, terrible precedent, because it means that you have hundreds upon hundreds of separate governments who all can potentially have independence and very little oversight.
Yeah. Yeah, it's even if, and I was really pleased to see a variety of very liberal pundits, and by a variety I mean one. I mean exactly one. This is like classic news stuff. Some people say, and by some I mean that guy
Joe
that I agree with and that I was just chatting with in the hall. It's Sagar from I don't know why names are impossible for us. It's not that hard. I hear his name regularly. Anyway, breaking points, dude. He and
Why
what's
did you
her
put
face?
yourself in this position? You should have just
bring
kept
up a
going.
second person whose name I can't remember. Oh gosh, we'll blame being. How long have I been sick? We're gonna take a break here while we just corpse into our microphones.
Him and then
they split though,
Sorry.
which was interesting. The two of them, they're more Bernie Sanders socialism style thinkers, but I know his last name's Engetti. He specifically said we don't want the administrative agencies making choices beyond the scope of what Congress gave them power to, even when it's favorable to us, because it's anti-democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And if what you believe is that government ought to rule based on some form of consent, hence the need for a democratic form of some kind,
Mm-hmm.
then an administrative agency deciding something contrary to the wishes of not only the group who made it, but the Congress there now that could pass this if they wanted to, right?
Mm-hmm.
That it's been have debated it, struck down, and I think, as you said, maybe even passed a resolution saying they didn't want a mandate. Then who are we ruled by? What form of government do we have if the important decisions are made by OSHA?
Independent of the body
Independent
that
and
represents
even
us.
contrary to the
Mm-hmm.
will of the body that represents us.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's something fundamentally off about that. And you may say, well, for the sake of such and such emergency, we allow it, right? We justify these things on the basis of this is so important. Don't make that trade. Don't make that trade. If you justify it once, it justifies all the other agencies. It justifies the abuses that are perpetual from these agencies.
Yeah, and if the argument is that it's time sensitive, President Biden announced that OSHA was going to pass this ruling, and then weeks went by before OSHA announced something. Weeks. Which, as we've seen with Congress in times of crisis, they can actually pass things. If they agree, they can pass things quite quickly. The problem is they often don't agree because the people themselves don't agree. We, as the United States, don't agree on how to respond to COVID. And that's okay, but what it means is we can't have broad, sweeping national mandates because of that. Because of our democratic process. If you want those things, and you're willing to give up the democratic process, that means something else entirely. But anyways, he asked OSHA to come up with this, took them weeks, and then once they rolled it out, it had at least a couple of months before anything happened. You know what I mean? They had a significant delay on something that was supposed to be a right here and right now crisis. You know what I mean? And yet they took months and months to get it going, which is telling, because in that time, Congress could have passed its own thing.
Right. And you'll note that if you've been following Omicron and some of the other podcasts we've done, obviously a mandate won't make a difference in the face of Omicron. So it's entirely irrelevant. In many ways, it will make a difference. But in terms of what it's supposed to do, it doesn't work with Omicron. But that's even besides the point, right? What we're talking about is the constitutional issues here.
Yeah, even if it was the most effective thing you could do for COVID, even if if staying this decision and allowing this mandate to proceed could have cured COVID on the spot, wouldn't have changed the legal arguments.
Yes. It's interesting. We are one different presidential election away from having this decision go through, right? From having OSHA authorized in making this vaccine mandate, right? If instead of Trump, it had been Hillary Clinton and she had appointed three justices, this decision goes completely differently. That 6-3, it was a 6-3 decision on the OSHA mandate, and it would go the other way. We mentioned that there's a second case. The second case was the vaccine mandate for hospitals. Hospitals receiving funding with regards to Medicaid and Medicare, which is
most hospitals.
You've got to be trying really hard not to fit under that umbrella.
We've talked about that before when we talked about the Oklahoma Surgery Center and how hard it was for them to not take any federal funding and cut themselves off from that whole pipeline, which has clearly panned out well for them, looking at the strings that come attached to that money.
Their applications just went through the roof. Here's what's interesting about that. So that decision was 5-4. The decision to allow to do it with hospitals was 5-4. Right, so we got 6-3 to prevent a broad every employment above a certain number. 6-3. Hospitals exclusively, 5-4.
The other way.
That's
important.
Right.
Yeah, because the mandate was struck down for the employees, but the mandate for the hospitals was held. Place.
Right. Thank you. I wasn't making that clear. Within these two cases, we have a really interesting touchstone for where all of the justices fit into a debate, because there's actually not two positions on the 6-3 OSHA mandate. There are three positions on the 6-3 OSHA mandate. There's the position that says OSHA has been authorized to do this, and they can do this, and they did this, and it should be upheld, right? This is the three liberal justices.
The
dissenters. Of the six, there are actually two factions. There are three of them who said in an unsigned, it's interesting, the majority opinion of this is unsigned, which means we don't know who would have signed it. It's possible that the majority opinion, the per curiam opinion, the one that's written by, it's not even stated who wrote it, but presumably Roberts, who's in charge, who decides who gets to write these things. He either wrote it or decided to, and he has a major hand in orchestrating how this all looks and how unified the court looks and doesn't look. There's a whole game here behind the scenes. And Roberts is weird on this, really weird. His positions are inconsistent at best, and he makes decisions for strange reasons, going all the way back to Obamacare is most famously where he was the deciding vote that allowed that to go through. But anyway, this isn't going to be a lecture on Roberts and how odd he is. But the point is that Roberts and Kavanaugh and her name, Barrett. I got it. I got one. And Barrett are all did not sign on the concurring opinion that Thomas, Gorsuch, and Alito signed.
Which is significant. Why?
Which is significant because they don't share that opinion.
So tell us about that opinion.
So here's where they split. Here's where they split and where their views split. They agree that OSHA has significant broad authority from Congress, but that in this particular case, the statutes were not specific enough to include this broad vaccination scheme. They make a variety of distinctions between things like, this is not an occupational hazard, this is a public health hazard, right? This is of a different kind than specifically what OSHA is allowed to address. You could imagine that if the Nazis were bombing America and OSHA existed at the time, that under the guise of workplace safety, OSHA could make military rules, right? Right? And we'd go, that's not workplace safety. Mm-hmm. That's something else, even though obviously it affects safety at work, right? And that's basically the argument they're making here. The majority, they're like, this is not the same kind of thing. You're making public health policy. And they make a couple other arguments and look at some of the statutes, some of the specific vague lines that we mentioned. The other group is asking a more fundamental question. The other three, Thomas, Gorsuch, Alito. Their position is at what point has Congress given an executive agency legislative power? And where is the line? And how do we stop being ruled by administrative agencies? They're looking at something much bigger.
They're asking the broad questions that we keep asking in this podcast. That what has happened here with these agencies, and how are these agencies honoring what they were supposed to be?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Instead of saying, in this particular case, is the vague wording enough under this broad purpose? They're asking, shouldn't the legislature be making important decisions? Period. Right? Isn't that their job? And that's a much broader critique, right? They're a faction who are at least, and maybe some of the other conservatives are open to some movement here. But at least in this opinion, we have three who have specifically said, we're seriously wondering whether whether executive agencies are fundamentally off, right? That we have, I get the sense that if they had been able to make the majority opinion, this would have overturned vast amounts of agency power, right? It wouldn't have been a decision about this case. It would have been a decision about executive agencies categorically, right? And it would have had massive impact. And I want to get to that point so bad. Like there are, it's fun. I wrote this down earlier. How many federal agencies exist? the title of a fun article. And it's a fun
Well,
question.
before you get to that, Dan,
Please
I just want to
respond,
clarify
and then
that you also see that same distinction when you look at the other case with the hospitals.
Yes.
That switch, the reason they switch is because of that.
Yes.
Is because the dissenting group there is that same 3 plus Barrett,
Mm-hmm.
and they're the group saying, yes, even though there is more minutia in the law for this hospital mandate, it still is a general violation of the principle that Congress should be doing this, not these government agencies.
Yes, thank you.
And so,
Thank you.
the difference between the reason these two cases were decided differently is because although there's a majority agreement that OSHA does not have this specific power, there is not a majority agreement that these agencies in general should only have the explicit power given them by Congress. And that's what we'd like to see is if that number was 5 instead of 4 in the hospital case, it wouldn't just change the hospital case, it would also change how the Supreme Court is looking at agencies in general, which would be amazing. That's what we want to see. We want to see that shift, that even though this is good, that we got one of the two, in terms of what we personally believe about the mandates, what we're looking for here and what we're seeing a trend toward and potentially could happen, but it depends on what happens in the next presidential elections and blah, 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 is a shift away from the ever-growing
bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Yeah, the bureaucracy it's anti-democratic, right? It's fundamentally at odds with the idea that your decision should affect government.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that, I'm so glad you pointed out to that other case because there are at least 3 and Barrett is 4 on that other case. So somewhere in there is something she agrees with them and perhaps they could get a 5th in the right case. But if not, then we're probably one Supreme Court justice away from being able to significantly shift the administrative state. And
now we just need Biden to appoint a Supreme Court justice that will strike down the only power he has left, which is through the agencies.
Yeah, and it's not likely. Breyer's getting old, but he has made no. People who've tried to get him to retire. Breyer is one of the liberal justices on the court. He's 84, I think we decided. But he's fairly healthy, and so he's made no signs that he's going to step down, despite the fact that there was for a time when Biden first got elected, news articles seemingly every month that are like, hey dude, retire. Like, retire before we lose the Senate and we can't replace you with someone we agree with.
By the way, I want to clarify one more thing real quick, which is that although we very often disagree with conservatives, there are whole slews of issues like drug laws and immigration, free trade that we disagree strongly with conservatives. We tend to agree, not completely, but a lot more with conservative Supreme Court justices, and that's because the conservative versus liberal line with justices has more to do with interpretation than specific policy. Conservative justices tend to follow a more strict construction of the Constitution, which limits federal power, while liberal justices tend to say if it's good, then it's okay to expand federal power. And that's why, although we disagree with conservatives on many issues, when it comes to justices, we far prefer strict constructionists, which tend to be conservative. Not always, as we're seeing with these cases here, where you have conservative justices,
Roberts and Kavanaugh,
who are clearly not being strict constructionalists, and I don't know why. But here we are. But that's want to clarify what we're looking for and why we keep talking favorably about conservative justices, not because of the conservative viewpoints, but because of how they're viewing the Constitution.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Kavanaugh is a really interesting Supreme Court justice pick from Trump. He's terrible. He really is. Like, if you take away the Me Too stuff, and he might get shot down by conservatives. But because of the Me Too stuff, every conservative voted for him. Even though there were there were red flags. there were a lot of red flags. Anyway, he seems like he's going to be like Roberts. He's going to be very moderate. He's going to be very wishy-washy on a lot of things. Mm-hmm. That's just the way it is, unfortunately. Once he's out of control. It's a really bad way to phrase once he's gone. Once he's gone, the court's going to be a very different place. He maneuvers it in very strange ways and uses his authority to avoid controversy and to avoid the kind of big changes from the Supreme Court that would be a return to a strict reading. He deliberately tries to avoid that. He claims he does it in the name of not wanting to prevent the will of the people. but the will of the people here is entirely up to his interpretation. Yeah. I was going to read some fun numbers on how many federal agencies exist. So how many federal agencies exist depends on who you ask.
There's not one answer to that question. Yes,
there is not one. So there was a administrative conference of the United States, which listed 115 agencies in an appendix. An appendix was titled Sourcebook of United States Executive Agencies.
Which is a ton, by the way.
115. Right. Actually, the actual number of agencies isn't that important because you could have one that's so powerful that it ruins everything.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a handful of agencies that have so much power that it's insane.
Yeah, OSHA is extremely powerful, but more importantly,
like the FDA itself is huge.
Right, the FDA and the what's the energy one? Maybe I'm thinking FDA. Anyway, or
the Securities Exchange Commission. That one's huge. Yeah. That has incredible impact.
There are, and you dig into what they do and their ability to basically legislate laws, judge the laws, punish people.
But yeah, if there were just 5 of these big agencies,
it'd be too many.
It'd be too much power.
Yes, I agree. Any one of them is sufficient to justify a curtailing of them in general. But here are other places where you can try and find how many agencies there are. There's a unified agenda that lists 61. There's FOIA.gov, which is part of the Department of Justice, lists 252. The 2016 Federal Register Index lists 272. Regulations.gov has 292. The United States Government Manual has 316. The Federal Register Agency list has 440. US.gov tally puts it at 443. You could argue about what constitutes an agency and a sub-agency versus a fundamentally different thing. And so on. So it is largely arbitrary, but the fact that we don't know how many is a bad sign. The fact that you can't even list them, right? There was a funny interview where
even if it were just 61, could you list 60 of them?
No, but I'd spell them really well. This is the stance. Let me read one quick statement from the 3, Gorsuch, Thomas, and Alito, who want a more fundamental change. This is from the OSHA mandate. They wrote a concurring opinion, right? A concurring opinion meaning they agree with the holding, which is to stop the mandate, but that they disagree or may disagree or have additional reasons, depending on if they sign the majority opinion. You can sign more than one opinion, but we don't know who signed the main opinion because it was
unsigned
for political reasons. They hid that. Yeah, we don't even know who wrote it. The question before us is not how to respond to the pandemic, but who holds the power to do so. The answer is clear. Under the laws it stands today, that power rests with the states and Congress, not OSHA. In saying this much, we do not impugn the intentions behind the agency's mandate. Instead, we only discharge our duty to enforce the law's demands when it comes to the question, who may govern the lives of 84 million Americans? Respecting those demands may be trying in times of stress, but if this court were to abide them only in more tranquil conditions, declarations of emergencies would never end, and the liberties our Constitution's separation of powers seeks to preserve would amount to little. Close quote. It's true. There's always some claim of emergency. If you're going to bend the rules in an emergency, the rules don't matter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I really like that line. Who gets to govern 84 million Americans? Can OSHA do that? Or is that supposed to be Congress's job? And it's a fundamental question about what can be, how much of that power can be delegated. We've talked about at other points that there's such a mess here with the agencies. The legislature used to be able to hold them accountable. Like, we created you, and here's how it's going to work. You're going to report back to us, and we're going to be able to follow up and make sure you're doing what you're doing. They struck that down. That was struck down in earlier court cases, to the point where now Congress makes them, and then they're completely independent of Congress in bizarre ways. Right? That doesn't even make sense. They're exercising legislative authority, but as executive bodies, and it is its own fourth branch of government, and it is in many ways the most powerful branch. Any closing remarks? Anything else?
No, I think that paragraph was a great closing remark, that it comes down to who holds the power, and right now the agencies hold that power, and that needs to change if we want to have good government. I think that it starts with these agencies being benevolent dictators, and then it can turn into something else quite easily, and that's something that we definitely don't want.
Congress can make these decisions. They don't have to because of the agencies, and so they don't. It's not a they can't, so the agencies do. It's a Congress is taking full advantage of the agencies.
Yeah, Congress is doing what Roberts is doing, is avoiding the difficult issues because they can. Because they can, yeah. They can let the Supreme Court and the agencies work it out. With that, thank you for listening. This has been an episode of Rethinking Politics. You can find us on all of the major podcasting apps or on YouTube. You can reach out to us at rethinkingpoliticspodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our website at rethinkingpolitics.podbean.com, where you can support us via Patreon. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.